The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the Yaron Brook Show. I hope you're having a great weekend. It's certainly beautiful here in Puerto Rico. Maybe beach tomorrow. We'll see. I am really pleased today to have Matt Ridley back as a guest. We talked, I think, at the beginning of this Corona mess and a couple of months ago, and since then the book has come out. We discussed how innovation works and why it flourishes in freedom, which has just come out. You can download it on Kindle, and you can order it from Amazon here in the United States. Is it out in the UK as well? I know there were some delays.
Not quite yet. No, it's out in a couple of weeks in the UK, and it has a special afterword about coronavirus in it in the UK. So they get something extra. Good. But it was too late to stop the printing in the US. But it's available on audio too, and you get my own dulcet tones reading it.
Oh, excellent. So go purchase the book. Highly recommend it. I really enjoyed it. Great stories of innovation and a real good theoretical kind of starts with the stories and then a theoretical overlay on that. I didn't agree with everything. I don't assume anybody will agree with everything, but I got a lot of value out of it, and I think you guys will too. So, Matt, thank you for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Not at all. Thank you for having me back on the show, Yaron. It's really kind of you.
Sure, absolutely. And I know we're all kind of hunkered down. We were just talking about the fact that both of us would like to travel, and neither of us are traveling much. I've canceled all of my commitments through the early fall, and wouldn't be surprised if some of those got canceled, and Matt is in the same position. And yeah. I never thought I'd get to the point where I actually miss airplanes and airports.
I'm still enjoying the fact that I'm not trudging through airports. But you're right. At a certain point, it's gonna. I think it doesn't really matter while it's summer weather, but if it turns to winter and we still can't travel, I think it'll be a shame. Yep. I mean, it's fine for someone like me. I work well from home. I live in a nice area. It's brutal for people who are stuck in small apartments in cities. These lockdowns they're crazy. Apart from anything else, they're killing the economy, and they're not achieving what they set out to, and they're horrible for people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, people talk about the idea that people are worried about the economy when lives are at stake, but it's not about the economy. It's just people. It's just people living their lives. It's just people going about making a living, but also being able to enjoy life. And these lockdowns have sucked that enjoyment out of the capacity to live.
No, I'm really worried that there are people who think that the economy is something somebody else creates for you to enjoy, and they should be getting on with it, and you can come back and take part in it when it's there. But that isn't the way it works.
And all we need is to print up some money and hand it to people, and the economy just continues to function fine, as if nobody actually has to work to produce the things that we consume with that money. And although printing money is somehow costless, yeah, there's no downside to just somebody with a printing press printing out money and distributing it.
You're right. And we keep hearing sort of self-indulgent schemes about how when we come back, we should do it in a different way, and only have, knitted sandals for footwear and solar panels for energy and so on. Really expensive projects that were a luxury at the best of times and are going to be even more so as we come out of this recession.
I mean, I'd like this to come out differently as well, but on the opposite side, I'd like us to learn the lesson and embrace freedom on the other side of this, not embrace more authoritarianism. So I really wanted to talk a little bit about COVID because while it's not in the news right now, while these demonstrations are going on, I find it really interesting that the whole discussions of social distancing are suddenly out the window. Nobody cares anymore.
Strange, isn't it?
And wearing masks because it's a good cause, right? So it doesn't matter, as if the economy, making a living life is not a good cause.
Right.
I thought we'd talk a little bit about the science of COVID. I mean, you're a science writer. You've written a lot about COVID in the last few months. I've really enjoyed a lot of your articles on COVID. So where are we in terms of understanding the virus today, and how lethal it is, and its different features?
Well, we know a lot about it, but we also don't know a lot about it. That was a sort of theme of one of the articles I wrote, was that we know everything and we know nothing, because we know its exact genomic sequence, which is 29,900 base pairs, give or take a few in different strains. We know that it's got 15 genes. We know what each one of them does. We know where the cleavage site is in the middle of the spike protein, which enables it to get inside different types of human cells. The virology, the genomics, the molecular biology of this thing is spectacularly well known. But we are still finding things out about its pathology, about which tissues it infects, about why it affects the blood system as well as the respiratory system, why it causes strokes, whether it has neurological, mental effects, and above all, about where you catch it and how you catch it. And I think one of the lessons we failed to learn quickly enough is that it is a surprisingly strongly a hospital-acquired infection. That's because it tends to thrive in frail elderly people, a lot of whom are in hospital. And although healthy young people can carry it and give it to others, they don't tend to get very sick, and they don't tend to be very efficient transmitters, as far as we can make out. So, when we look back and are honest with ourselves, we will, I think, find it crazy that we let it get into the hospitals and the care homes so easily, while trying to shut it down in the rest of society, where actually it wasn't that harmful. And it might even prove to be a mistake. If it's running around in the community among young people, it may evolve towards low virulence faster. Mm-hmm. And if we keep it confined mainly to hospitals and care homes, it may not have the same incentive to evolve towards lower virulence. There are weird things like that that's probably not right, by the way, but it's something we need to consider.
Yeah. And in what ways did it spread? Because you wrote an article, and it surprised me, but it made sense that early on, this really was a phenomenon of hospitals, and the doctors were the carriers. And
yeah, I mean, if you take the UK, in February, we were beginning to worry about this, and we were looking at what was happening in Italy. But we said, oh my God, we're going to get this from China, from people turning up at airports and going to restaurants and giving it to other people in London. And a little bit of that happened, but the majority of it was people coming back from holiday in Italy and bringing it back there. Now, quite a lot of those would have been healthcare workers. Doctors and nurses like to go skiing. They come back, they don't feel ill. They might have a little tickle in their throat or something, but they're young enough. They're not the kind of people who get ill with this disease. This is one of the weird things about this disease, because it doesn't fell you if you're young. It often is hardly symptomatic at all. Indeed, it can be completely asymptomatic. That makes you a very good spreader, because you actually go and meet other people. So there's one South African hospital where they know exactly who the index case was, a traveler from Europe who arrived and came into the hospital and went into the emergency room. And there he infected another patient in the next bed who was there for a stroke. Now, between them, they infected a nurse. The nurse infected 3 other patients. The 3 other patients infected a bunch of other doctors and nurses, and so on. And you can actually trace it going from ward to ward through this hospital. And funnily enough, it wasn't the intensive care unit that was worse, because they had better practices there. Mm-hmm. But in the other wards where they weren't thinking about it, in the cardiology wards and so on, suddenly it was starting to fell people. In countries like the UK, we didn't do a good enough job of getting personal protective equipment to people in the healthcare system. And we did something much worse too. We said, oh my God, there's going to be a wave of people coming into the hospital from the community with this disease. So we need to clear the wards. We need to get people out of hospital. So we said to a lot of old people who were in hospital, look, you should leave your bed and you should go to a care home. And of course, what they did was they took the virus with them to the care home.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, but some really bad mistakes were made of that kind.
Absolutely. And does the fact that it is primarily prevalent in hospitals and obviously the elderly are the susceptible, people are talking about these demonstrations and the fact that there's no social distancing. Does that worry you at all, or is because it's outside and because these are mostly young people, this will probably not cause kind of a second wave?
I think the latter. I do. I think these viruses are so seasonal. If you look at other coronaviruses that cause common colds, or you look at flu viruses, they always die out in the springtime. They do not like ultraviolet light from the sun. They do not like the ventilation of the outdoors. They much prefer winter. They almost vanish completely. It's almost as if they disappear from the face of the earth for a few months, and then they reappear in the autumn. So I think for that reason, also because it's younger people, these events aren't perhaps as dangerous as we might think. Mm-hmm. But I do think that apart from hospitals and care homes, the other big risk factor was large indoor gatherings. So, crowded bars at a ski resort in northern Italy, football matches where people are cramming into a stadium or something like that, discos, etc. Obviously, the older the better in terms of people in the crowd to get it spreading, or rather, the younger the better to prevent it spreading. It feels to me like the measures that we could take voluntarily, as Sweden did, like saying no large gatherings, voluntary social distancing, keep your distance from people, wash your hands, etc., that would have been enough. Now, how do we know that would have been enough? Well, two reasons. One, Sweden has got away with, it's not a great epidemic. There's quite a lot of people died in Sweden. They've had a care home problem too. They were careless about letting it into the care homes and the hospitals as well. But whereas the models were forecasting they would get 90,000 cases by now, 90,000 deaths by now, if they did nothing, and 40,000 if they did a full lockdown, they didn't do a full lockdown, and they've had less than 5,000 cases. So that seems to me pretty damning of the models. The models were assuming some homogeneous community population in which it spread randomly, and it isn't like that. It's certain events and certain people are much better at spreading it than others. And if you can work out on those. The other reason we know that it's not that it was the voluntary measures that really counted was that if you look at a country like Britain, the curve was already flattening before we brought the lockdown in. Yeah. The peak of infections we now know was around the 20th of March. We didn't lock down until the 23rd of March. It looks like we needn't have destroyed the economy. We could have kept on going to work, but just said to people, be sensible, stay away from crowds, don't go to a bar, don't go to a football match, all that kind of thing. Wear a mask, don't shake hands, don't wash hands. I mean, do wash hands, and so on. And I think that would have been the right answer. Now, admittedly, I didn't know that at the time. I thought maybe we were right to lock down. It did seem like a dangerous disease, and it did seem that it was spreading. But I didn't pick up that the vast majority of these cases in the hospitals were not people arriving at hospital from the community feeling sick.
People already there.
The vast majority of people were already there.
Yeah, I mean, talk about football, I mean, or sports. I mean, in the United States, this really all hit home when the NBA shut down. And that was voluntary. That was not coerced. That was not a state policy. It was voluntary. And you could have got a lot of this done with voluntary measures.
Well, also the states that unlocked early have now had a month of easing the lockdown, and there's no sign of a pickup.
No,
there's no sign of a significant one.
What do you make of the fact that this is, given the seasonality, that this is so bad in Brazil, particularly in a warm place like the Amazon? I was just watching a show yesterday where Manaus, the city in the middle of the Amazon, is really hit hard, and I was surprised.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it suggests to me that in Manaus, a lot of people spend a lot of time indoors. I don't know whether that's true, but it's a pretty hot place, probably very dependent on air conditioning, and I dare say air conditioning systems might be quite good at spreading this. So I don't really know. I haven't looked into the Brazilian situation in at all much detail. I have just written an article which might be of interest to you and the viewers about what might have been the previous new coronavirus epidemic that went global.
Okay.
1889, a pandemic called the Russian influenza spread from Central Asia through St. Petersburg, through Western Europe to the United States, and flared up in the winter, killed something like 4 million people, and died out in March. Now, it has always been assumed that this was a form of influenza, but the symptoms have never quite matched influenza. There's odd things about the symptoms. Well, it turns out that the commonest of the coronavirus common colds, the one which is responsible for about 10% of our colds, is called OC43, and it's a coronavirus like this. And if you examine its genome and you compare it to the genome of its nearest relative, which is a virus that infects cattle, but both of which are descended from a virus that infects rodents, the cattle and the human one diverged in 1889 or thereabouts. Actually, 1890 was the estimate, but it's within a few years of that period. So the thinking is that might have been a coronavirus epidemic and new to our species. And of course, the good news there is that it got tamer. It turned into a common cold that we all get all the time, and it doesn't hurt us. And the other good news is it left us with a lot of cross immunity. And we're beginning to find now that there is what's sometimes called immunological dark matter in human beings. There are people who just can't catch this thing. They're married to somebody who gets it very badly. They don't social distance from them. They live in the same house and they never go down with it. Why is that? Well, it looks like between 40 and 60% of us have some kind of T cell immunity that works quite well against this virus if it gets into us. It's not B cell, it's not specific antibodies, but it is T cell. Now, the suggestion is that these are the people who've had one of these coronavirus colds.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. And that, again, reduces the risk dramatically.
Well, it means that you can reach herd immunity with possibly as little as 15% of the population infected with this new virus. And that's what Stockholm has achieved. That's what I think London has now achieved. There's been very few new cases in London in recent days. And that's probably because about 15% of Londoners have now had it. And the virus just can't spread beyond that, particularly if we're doing social distancing.
Sure. So somebody's asking about, there's been a second wave in Iran. Do you know anything about that and why that's happened?
I haven't looked into that. I'm following as much as I can, but I haven't looked into that. That sounds interesting, and it could easily be possible.
And then there's somebody else is saying there's a talk of masking and social distancing school-age children in the fall. Do you think that's good for children, or do you think that is justified?
The whole masking debate is a strangely difficult one. It flared up in the US quite early. In the UK, we kept saying, no, we mustn't wear masks. It's a mistake to wear masks. Why not? They can't do any harm and they might do some good. Well, it turns out that we were worried about too much of a run on masks, and then there wouldn't be any masks available for people working in the health service.
Yeah.
Well, I think that misunderstands supply and demand. If there's a run on things, then people make more of them. But anyway, there we are.
Yep. Econ 101, they need more of that. Yes. That's across the board. I mean, if they'd allow the price system to adjust for ventilators, for masks, for PPE, there wouldn't be a shortage of it.
Well, absolutely. And in the UK, we had an insistence on not using the private sector for PPE, for logistics, for diagnostic testing. No, we can do it all in our labs. That's crazy. The logistics really broke down. It was difficult to get the tests to the right parts of the country. Well, look out the window. There's logistics going on every day. There are supermarkets remaining stocked throughout this process. There's somebody out there who knows how to do logistics. It's called the private sector. Use it.
Oh, we saw the same thing in the US with the CDC trying to develop the test and not bringing in the private sector until very late, and testing was way.
Well, they weren't as late as us. They changed their mind a little bit earlier than we did in the UK. I'm sure
everybody was late though, given the information they had. So masks. I mean, my only thing about masks is I look at Asia and I see them using a lot of masks, and they seem to have handled this pandemic. Now, correlation is not causation. I know that, but since we don't know that much about this, it seems like not a bad rule to follow mask use.
I do think Japan is going to be very, very interesting when this is over. They've had hardly any deaths. They've got dense cities. They've got huge populations. They've not locked down. They've not done a particularly large amount of testing. But what they have done is really, really good infectious control. So, if you go to a hospital in Japan, for whatever reason, you have very little chance of either catching it or passing it on. And I think that will end up being the secret. It's a bit like MRSA and other things like that. I turned my phone onto airplane mode and it went and rang. That's outrageous.
It is. So there's a lot of talk about vaccines and the possibility of a vaccine. It sounds like we might not need one, which is interesting, given where this virus is heading. But what is the possibility of a vaccine? I hear a lot of conflicting information. You being quite skeptical about the ability to do a vaccine quickly. Are you still skeptical of that?
Yes, I think we are better and better at doing vaccines, but we're not getting better fast enough. Mm-hmm. There are viral diseases we've been fighting for decades that we still can't get a vaccine to. I mean, HIV is a good example. Yeah. And there are others where, we've made the first steps, but we've not been able to get the final steps. Like Ebola, we were on the brink of developing a vaccine for Ebola when the epidemic came to an end. And that's often a problem. And that's a problem now with coronavirus because, for example, the team in Oxford, which is trying to develop a vaccine, now says our problem is that not enough people are now catching the disease. We need to be able to inject people with a vaccine, send them out into the community. Once we got the vaccine ready, it's still not quite ready yet, but once we do, send them out into the community and have them, not on purpose, but accidentally, run into somebody who's got the disease and see whether they catch it or not. Now, if we've managed to suppress the disease over the summer, that won't be possible. So they're going to have to go and test it in Brazil, by the look of it. So that is one of the problems. But it did shock me at the start of this epidemic, how slow we still are at making vaccines. The idea that it takes 1, 2, 3, 4 years to make a vaccine, if you can do it at all, is quite surprising because, as I say in my book, they developed a whooping cough vaccine in 4 years flat in the 1930s. You'd
without
think
without the genome, without DNA sequencing, without
exactly, they didn't even know what genes were made of in those days. They barely knew the difference between a virus and a bacterium in those days. In fact, it was a bacterium they were developing they were fighting for whooping cough, but it doesn't matter particularly. So we really haven't done a good job of directing innovation into the field of vaccine development. Why not? Partly because the private sector is not that interested. Vaccines are not profitable because if they're effective, they do themselves out of business too quickly. and partly because the public agencies, the aid-funded agencies that ought to be looking out for this, frankly, have not been doing the day job. I mean, if you look at the proportion of its budget that the World Health Organization spends on vaccine development, it's too small.
Yep.
And the World Health Organization put out a statement in 2015 to the effect that the greatest threat to human health in the 21st century is climate change.
Yep.
Right. Now, that suggests to me an organization that is not doing its day job.
Absolutely.
It's not the World Health Organization's job to worry about climate change. That's the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They ought to be looking out for pandemics. So until the Gates Foundation came along and funded some really inspired and good work on vaccine development for things like pneumococcus and other things, there was a real issue that we weren't doing enough of it. And that was too late. I mean, if the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust and others had set up their Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, if they'd done that 10 years before, not in 2017, but 2007, then who knows where we might be now. We might have a platform for developing vaccines quickly that would have come to our rescue. So I suspect we will get a vaccine to this one. Unlike HIV, it doesn't hide inside the human genome. It's a large virus. It doesn't evolve fast. It has a proofreading mechanism to stop its genes changing too fast. That implies that it's a bit of a sitting duck for a vaccine if we can develop one. The reason it doesn't need to do all those things is because it is very contagious, so it can jump onto another person. It doesn't mind being destroyed in the first person. So I suspect we will get there. I suspect one of the many projects in train will work, and some of them are quite ingenious and new. But I don't think we'll see much impact before next year, and I don't think it necessarily will solve the problem in time.
And it sounds like the problem might go away by that time in terms of just
yes. I would remain open to the possibility that there will be a second wave next winter, because the seasonality is so strong in these things that it will flare up again in some places and sometimes. But surely by then we'll know what to do to stop it becoming a problem, and to clamp down on it fast, and to copy what the Japanese or the Koreans or the Taiwanese did.
You would think that we learn. What about treatment? Are there any kind of innovations in terms of the treatment of this?
Well, I think this is really interesting, because if you think about the HIV case, we have largely now managed to defeat HIV. It is getting less bad all the time. It's killing fewer people every year. It's been a long battle, and it's not over yet. But the reason is not because we developed a vaccine, but largely because we have a treatment. Mm-hmm. Now, these treatments are called protease inhibitors, and they're pretty rough drugs. They're not drugs you would want to take if you didn't have a life-threatening disease, but they work. And that's possibly the first time we've defeated a virus epidemic with a treatment rather than a prevention, with a treatment rather than a vaccine. And that's quite interesting. Now, if you look at the Ebola epidemic of 2014-15, we also got some effective treatment going there. We tested a lot of drugs, protease inhibitors, but also nucleotide analog ones, and monoclonal antibodies, these antibody treatments, which work quite well. And indeed, the current epidemic of Ebola in the Congo is being largely combated with antibody treatments. So we have moved a long way towards the holy grail, which has always been lacking from medicine, which is a treatment for a virus. You know, when you go to see your doctor and say, look, I've got this terrible stinking cold, what can you give me? There is literally nothing he can give you. If he gives you an antibiotic, he's wasting your time and his time. If he gives you an aspirin, he may help with some of the symptoms, but that's all. So we would love the equivalent of antibiotics for viruses, antiviral medications. And the reason they're so hard to develop is because viruses don't have their own chemistry set the way bacteria do. They borrow ours.
Yep.
And so if we attack it, then you attack yourself. But there are some ingenious ones out there. I got quite excited about a Japanese one called favipiravir, which was showing good promise against influenza and Ebola, and looks like it might be a general anti-RNA virus treatment. But I'm told it's been a little disappointing in some of the early clinical trials. Likewise, remdesivir, it's a mixed picture. Likewise, hydrochloroquine. But that was a rather shocking story, because the Lancet published this paper saying that the hydrochloroquine tests were failing to produce decent results. And everyone said, right, that's it. And they cancelled all the hydrochloroquine trials. And it turned out the paper was based on fraudulent data that somebody had made up. It's a really shocking blot on the record of the Lancet. And I'm actually surprised that there hasn't been a resignation of the editor from that publication as a result of that episode.
Yep. What is your general sense of hydrochlorine in terms of a potential,
well,
crucial, obviously.
Yeah, I've always been a little bit surprised, ready to be surprised if it does work very well. Yeah. There's no terribly good reason, biochemically speaking, why it would be a wonder drug. And it is, after all, designed for fighting malaria parasites, which are quite different beasts, vastly larger and different creatures. But that's not to say it might not have an effect, and it does look like it's well worth looking at. And anything that helps is a good plan. Sure. The other thing to take into account is that it's not an injection that leaves you feeling miserable that you'll only want to take if you've got a really bad bout. It's a well-known pill that we've tested and used in human beings for decades, and it's just a pill. So why not try it? It might be you need to take it with zinc. I think zinc deficiency and the immune effects of that is something we need to look harder at. There is some quite good evidence that that's an issue. But the trouble is, quite a lot of quacks go on about that. And so much of the medical establishment doesn't like to talk about that because they think it's a quack remedy idea.
Is vitamin D also, vitamin D deficiency also potentially related?
Well, I've been banging the drum about vitamin D for weeks now, and I'm not getting through to the medical establishment or the political one. Because in a country like the UK, vitamin D deficiency is rampant at the end of winter. Yep. Most people, myself included, I happened to have a vitamin D test in January as part of a routine blood test, and I noticed that my vitamin D was low. And although my doctor said it wasn't life-threatening, I've started taking vitamin D supplements. And I looked into the literature on this, and it turns out that very few Brits have enough vitamin D in their system at the end of winter. And it's nothing to do with what they're eating. I mean, if you eat a ton of cod liver oil, you can have enough vitamin D, but that's about the only food source that you'll get it from. An ordinary diet, even with plenty of fish in it, won't give you enough. What you need is sunlight. Sunlight is what makes vitamin D, and there ain't much sunlight in northern England in winter.
And then this is not to go into the sunlight without tons of sunscreen, because then you'll...
Well, this is also true. And so who are the three groups of people who turn out to be particularly prone to vitamin D deficiency? Obese people, because vitamin D tends to be sequestered in fat cells. The elderly, because they don't tend to spend enough time outdoors. And people with dark skins. Yep. All three have proved to be somewhat higher in risk of getting serious COVID disease. So as I read the evidence, and there's lots of trials now, they're not gold standard trials. As I read the evidence, vitamin D probably doesn't prevent you catching the disease, but it does seem to affect whether or not you get it severely. And by the way, the evidence that vitamin D is involved in helping the immune system fight respiratory viruses is well established. That's not a speculation. That's been around in the literature for years. So it's terribly cheap to tell people to take vitamin D pills. Now that the sun has come out in the northern hemisphere and it's summertime, we're probably all right. And that might be one of the reasons that the virus goes away, is because it just can't find enough people with low vitamin D to infect.
Although I've lived my life, most of my life, I've lived in places with sunshine. And when I tested years ago, I was vitamin D deficient. I've been taking supplements since then. And it's, my rates are good, but they're not excessive because I'm out in the sun a lot. So some of us might need supplementation even in the summer.
That's right. No, I mean, there is some evidence from Australia and other places that people avoid the sun because they don't want to get sunburned and things. And on top of this, just think about what it must be like if you are a veiled woman in an Islamic country. You are not going to get sun on your skin ever. Yeah. Some studies of Muslim people living in northern England found that they really were very low in vitamin D, and that's a real concern, because added to it, when the public health bodies tried to have a program of encouraging vitamin D supplements in some of these ethnic minority communities in northern England, they ran into the problem that the pill might be made of gelatin, which might be derived from pork, and it was therefore against the religion of some of the people.
So we've got one more super chat question on this, and then we'll move on to other topics. What's Matt's view of the R number held over as a threat resulting in further lockdown? Is this another cynical political ploy to justify authoritarianism?
I don't think it's a cynical political ploy, but I do think it's a very foolish way of talking about the problem. I hate the fact that we are talking about this one R number. And here's why. R is going to be very, very different in different settings. So it's going to be high in a care home without people using protective equipment. It's going to be low in a school or a village in the countryside. Now, sure, you can make an average between the two and say that's your average. But even then, when you think about it, what's going on in the last few weeks in someone like the UK is that because of lockdown and voluntary social distancing, there is very little transmission in the community. So most of the cases that are turning up are going to be caused by someone coming out of a care home or a hospital and going to a home or going to a shop or something like that and giving it to. So the R that you're seeing in the community is actually an echo of the R in the healthcare system. So it's still not telling you what you want to know, which is it safe to ease the lockdown? So I think it's a crude measure and a misleading measure, and I wish they would stop talking about it. And it's part of the fetishization of models. Yep. I really think we've made a huge mistake in relying too much on modeling and not enough on, I nearly said too much on modeling evidence.
Yeah.
Now, that's a phrase that you will hear people use. There is no such thing as modeling evidence. There's evidence and there's modeling, but they are not the same thing.
No, I mean, models have their use. I'm in finance and we use models, but we also know their limitations, and we don't oversimplify them, and we know what they can do and what they can't do. And there's a fetish to simplify everything. I think and a model gives you a nice number. This is the number of people who die. And it's simple. And of course, the model itself isn't. There's a whole statistical analysis that most people wouldn't understand. But they like the output. And R is nice because it's one number. I can focus on one number. What people hate is complexity and subtleness, right? Subtle arguments in the world in which we live today are very different.
Yeah, you see people's eyes glaze over when you say, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, and
yeah, just give me an answer. Just tell me what to do. That's also why
Harry Truman said, give me a one-handed economist, so he can't say on the one hand, on the other.
Yeah. So let me remind everybody that Matt has just published a book, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. I've read the book, I own the book, and I recommend it. It's got some fabulous stories, and it's got some real juicy explanations, and makes the link between innovation and freedom, a link that is so necessary in the world in which we live. So I want to do some kind of questions about more broadly about innovation, and we've got a few here. Can you ask Matt about innovation in the aviation industry, which I don't think was a chapter in your book, but in the 70s we had the Concorde. Now we're back to flying 737s, and technology in airplanes hasn't changed that much.
Yeah.
Is that true, and why?
Isn't that fascinating? I write in the book about how in my lifetime there has been almost no improvement in speed in flight. In fact, there's been a regression, because not only have we given up on Concorde, but we've actually redesigned the swept wings of planes to make them slightly slower to save a bit of fuel. And then don't get me started on the congestion at airports and the time you spend going around in circles above busy airports to slow you down even more.
London.
And it, if you told me, not me, because I was 0 years old, but if you told someone in 1958 that we're actually going to go backwards in terms of plane speed over the next 50 years, they'd have been completely gobsmacked. And that is one of the prime examples of how we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking everything's getting faster and faster all the time. Innovation's helter skelter. However, there is one respect, and I do write about this in the book. There are two respects in which the aviation has shown extraordinary innovation over that period. One is safety. I think it was 2017, there was no passenger fatality at all, despite 35 million flights in a commercial jetliner. Now, that's extraordinary. So many more people are flying around the world, or they were before this current crisis. And yet the number of deaths is going down and down. If you measure it in terms of deaths per million revenue passenger kilometers, it's gone from something like 3,500 deaths 50 years ago in those units to something like 50 deaths if you average the last 5 years. And as I say, naught in one of those years. That's an amazing achievement. And I tried to understand what was the cause of this. Why are we killing fewer people in plane crashes? And the answers are really boring. They're better checklists, better designed dashboards, better procedures, more rules about how pilots check up on each other and all this kind of thing. Better automatic pilots, et cetera, et cetera. It's little incremental stuff. It's not one big thing. And it's learning. And the other thing is it's learning from failure. So the incredibly open way in which we investigate every crash and learn the lessons from it and share them throughout the industry has been a real help there. And in fact, it was a model that the oil industry copied after the Piper Alpha disaster, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a model of how to do it, how to learn from failure. The other way in which airlines have innovated is, of course, price. And I write quite a lot in the book about Southwest Airlines and what a splendid pioneer it was of cut price air travel. Cut price is the wrong word. What do I mean?
Discount air travel.
Yeah, exactly. And what a terrible battle it had to get started. I mean, they spent years in the law courts trying to fight off the insistent demand by the existing airline industry that they shouldn't be allowed to compete on price because it would lead to more crashes and things like that. Well, Southwest Airlines has an enviable track record.
So what do you make of the regression lately on the safety side with the 737 MAX, the two crashes, and they basically shut that program down for months now?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting story because up until that happening, the only crashes in recent years had been pilot suicides and things like that. Really deliberate crashes, or the shooting down of an airliner over Ukraine or whatever it might be. But those two crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia sent a shockwave through the industry, and rightly so. And as I read it, what happened there was that in competition with Airbus, Boeing realized it needed to produce a more fuel-efficient aircraft, a vastly more fuel-efficient aircraft, in order to boast about using less in the way of fossil fuels. That it was all about the climate agenda, really. And in doing so, they ended up producing a design that was effectively unstable in certain conditions. But they thought they could cope with that by putting in computer-aided automatic pilot stuff that would make it stable. And these turned out to have their own flaw and couldn't be overridden. And pilots were sent in the air with an airplane that wouldn't let you take back control under certain circumstances. And that seems to me an appalling thing to have done. And is quite a good check on our ambitions for artificial intelligence. Because although we have got very good automatic pilots that are helping pilots all over the world and have made flight much safer, and we probably could fly people around with nobody in the cockpit. And to some extent, one might begin to think, because of pilot suicides, that's actually safer. Although that's the case to some extent, just as on a road in a car, there is a very difficult transition from helping the pilot to taking over from the pilot. And I don't think making that final step is going to be easy on the road or in the air. I think, devices that stop me running into the car in front by automatically braking for me, but don't take over, but still require me to be alert and looking at the road, are going to be with me for the rest of my lifetime.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've been skeptical about that last piece in automobiles for a while, partially because of the kind of decisions that you'd have to program a computer to make. Run over the bicyclists or get me killed, or all these choices that we do kind of automatically, very, very quickly, sometimes well, sometimes poorly. How do you get agreement on what the algorithm should actually dictate that a car does?
I agree. And then talk about narrow rural lanes, but also the etiquette of driving, in a crowded city like London. You'll never get out of a junction if you wait for a gap. You have to edge out into the traffic and try and catch the eye of the taxi driver who's determinedly not looking at you, in the hope that he'll let you in. How's the algorithm going to do that?
Yeah, well, the cars are going to have to talk to each other, and one is going to have to slow to let the other one in. We're still a way away from that. I think ultimately we'll get there, but I think a way away from that.
I agree.
So what is it that has slowed air transportation? I mean, it's not that we don't demand fast airplanes, because I'd love to get to London in a couple of hours rather than in the 8 hours it takes. What is it that slowed it? Why haven't we innovated?
Well, one's automatic assumption would be that it would be something to do with overregulation, that we've killed innovation by making it too difficult to develop new models and that kind of thing. I don't think in this case that is the case. That is the case for nuclear power, for example, but I don't think it's the case for air travel. I think in the case of air travel, it looks much more like physical limits. That is to say, the diminishing returns of going faster in terms of extra cost are huge. Until you can hop into space and back down again, the air resistance is such that you have to burn a heck of a lot more fuel. And Concorde was just about viable in an era of extremely cheap oil, but by the end of the 70s, it made no sense at all.
I'm following the number of supersonic companies right now trying to change that and trying to propose models that
I haven't looked at it. I think there are some, and
yeah.
I was talking to a very interesting company about an air breathing engine that would go at extremely high altitudes effectively in space. And it did seem very convincing. It's all about concentrating what air there is so as to give the engine something to burn.
Yeah. Somebody I know is CEO of a company called Boom, which is trying to develop, which are pretty advanced now. I think they're ready for some trial flights in a year or two. So these take long periods of time, as you know, to put something like this together. Let's see. Maybe we could discuss this. How does the comment slow down bringing innovations such as self-driving cars to the market? So I guess the question is, do you see a slowdown in innovation generally in the world in which we live? And if so, what would be the cause of that? Is it regulations, or is it education? Is it what is actually going on?
Yeah, I end my book on a slightly pessimistic note, saying we are in an innovation famine, not a feast. That we are not having enough innovation. We could have more, particularly in the West, and particularly in the non-digital arena. So if you want to set up a new website, then that's easy, and lots of people are doing it. But in terms of inventing new gadgets and devices and machines and structures, yes, it's happening, but it's not happening as fast as it could. And the reasons for that are quite well set out in two books, which I thought were very helpful and very influential on me. One was Frederick Erickson's book, The Innovation Illusion, and the other was Brink Lindsay's book, The Captured Economy. And they both argue that big incumbent businesses with the ear of government have got themselves into a very powerful position to build barriers to entry for new competitors. And they've done so with all sorts of methods. And on the whole, they are preventing innovation happening. They also point out that a fantastically precautionary approach is being taken by government, foisted on it by basically neophobic, fear-mongering pressure groups. Mm-hmm. And then I would add at the same time, and Lindsay makes this point in his book, that the intellectual property system, this might be somewhere you and I disagree, actually. So the intellectual property system is on the whole hindering rather than helping innovation.
Yeah, I think there's research on the other side of that argument as well. So I'm skeptical, although I'm sure there are ways to improve the system. That is, I'm not going to defend the system as it is necessarily. I'm going to defend the principle behind it, which I think
exactly. And I think I'm happy with that. I don't want it thrown out. I want it reformed.
And exactly what that reform looks like, I've got friends who specialize in this, and I'm going to leave it to them. But the principle, I think, is what's important. To what extent do you think, so this is related to the precautionary principle, to what extent do you think is the influence of the environmentalist movement in a variety of different areas hindering innovation?
I think the environmentalist movement is enormously significant in the effect that it's had in hindering innovation. Just take three technologies: genetically modified organisms, biotechnology, shale gas, nuclear power. On all three, basically what the environmental movement has done is force regulators to adopt very, very expensive and slow-moving processes for approving products. They don't say no, but they take so long to say yes that the entrepreneurs give up and go away. And I tell the story in my book about golden rice, the biotech version of rice that has a vitamin A precursor in it, so it fortifies kids against the immune and other problems that you get, which is causing hundreds of thousands of deaths a year in poor countries where kids are dependent on rice as their main source of food. And these are people living in cities, so they don't have access to vegetables, and they're very poor people, etc. Huge problem in the world. Identified by biotechnologists more than 20 years ago as a soluble problem if we could just put a new gene in rice, not a new gene, a gene in rice from maize that makes it produce vitamin A precursors. It's just a no-brainer. They did it. It's a beautiful piece of work. They deserve every Nobel Prize going. They've given it away. Nobody's going to make money out of it. And yet Greenpeace has fought it tooth and nail every step of the way. And it doesn't matter how many kids die, Greenpeace still opposes it. And it runs out of arguments and it comes up with new ones and it keeps trying. It makes me very angry, actually. It's an appalling story. Beautiful recent book about it by Ed Regis. So did I get the name right? Yes, I think so. So do read that up.
Yep. Is it true that there's less innovation in Europe as compared to the US and Asia? And if so, would you say it's these, more regulation in Europe? Is that the cause?
Yes, that is true, and it is the cause. Europe has been unable to, has not only given up on biotechnology, but has also and turned its back on shale gas, which was a revolution that happened entirely in America. But it has also failed to produce the sort of competitive digital companies of scale that could go head to head with Google, Apple, Amazon, and their Chinese equivalents. So China can do it, California can do it, but Europe can't, basically. Why is that? Because on the whole, the European Commission regulatory system, although it says it's in favor of innovation, actually is very, very anti-innovative. It listens to big companies a lot. It's very easily lobbied. It tends to bring in rules that actually mitigate against innovative systems. And Brussels has this desire to impose exactly the same rules in every corner of the continent. Yep. What America has always done well is having slightly different regulations in different parts of America. So you can shop about to find a regime that's congenial. And that's what Europe was really good at for 500 years before that. It's not a question of lowering standards. It's a question of doing experiments in different ways of regulating things. Some ways are very effective at achieving both safety and innovation, and we need to discover those. Europe, in its policy of harmonization, doesn't do that. And this is, of course, the reason why Britain, main reason in my case, why Britain voted to leave the European Union.
So do you think there's hope now that the UK will adopt better strategies that will increase innovation in the UK?
This is the battle that is being joined. And with the example of genome editing at the top of the list, many of us are now desperately trying to persuade governments and officials, politicians and officials, to adopt policies that are pro-innovation, more pro-innovation than they have been under the European Union system, without compromising safety. And it's easily possible to do so. I can come up with a long list of examples of how you can achieve that. So we need to win the argument, but we're on the case.
That's great. So this is a last super chat question. Do you think we will be able to ethically, legally, molecularly engineer our bodies to live longer, be stronger? What do you think of the research and the technology that's being developing around this?
I'm not a person who thinks that the person who lives to 1,000 has already been born or something like that. Actually, if you look at the number of supercentenarians, that is people living past 110, the number's hardly changed in 30 years. We keep not breaking the record for the maximum lifespan. We get more people to 100, but we don't seem to be able to get more people to 115. So there's a kind of sell-by date in our genes in there somewhere that we're bumping up against. That said, I do think that we have the prospect of, and by the way, we could change that, but probably only by genetically engineering babies from scratch, if you see what I mean, which is a step too far ethically and should remain so for a long time, because you can't get informed consent from an unborn child. Where I think we will make advances is in so-called senolytic drugs, which are drugs that slow down the process of aging itself, not just the symptoms of aging. Mm-hmm. And though that could enable us to live longer, healthier lives, longer, healthy lives, rather than just longer lives. So in other words, to spend a longer time living and a shorter time dying.
Good. Well, that's, the sooner the better.
Exactly. It may not come in time for you and me, but some of the
probably
younger listeners.
Probably. All right, great. Thank you, Matt. Let me remind everybody of a few things. One is Matt just had his book published. It's called How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. It's available in the US in every format known to man, so you can go to Amazon and get it there. In the UK, it'll be coming out in a few weeks. Is that right?
Yep, 25 June.
25th of June, so in a few weeks, and you'll be able to get it then. And I'm sure once that's out, it'll be translated into many countries, in many languages. You'll be able to get it there as well. Don't forget, while you're at it, download the book, buy the book, but don't forget also to subscribe. And if you liked this interview, share it. Sharing is something that social media is built around. It's how the word gets out there. If you care about the future, if you think these are values you'd like other people to experience, then share, and don't forget to like the video. It helps with the algorithm, those algorithms, the more you like a video. Thank you, Matt. This has been delightful. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Yaron. Really good of you to have me on, and have a great weekend, and hope to see you in the flesh soon.
I hope so too. Make it to London one of these days. Thanks, Matt. Have a great weekend. All of you have great weekends, and I'll see you tomorrow with the show tomorrow. Bye, everybody.